sat silently in the corner of the table, the red wine in my hand shimmering under the chandelier above. Laughter echoed around the room, glasses clinking in rhythm with the sharp, mocking remarks. "Another month of unemployment, huh? Honey, maybe you should try applying as a coffee shop assistant. Who knows? You might get lucky." Max laughed loudly. His eyes sparkled with amusement, and I lowered my head, pretending to be embarrassed. The four men around the table joined in, bursting into laughter, completely unaware that in just a few hours their entire world would crumble beneath them. Max and his friends, smug in their expensive suits, always carried themselves like they were the most powerful men in the room. They were senior executives at Sterling Corporation, a leading tech company dominating the market. A company they believed they had built, developed, and led to success. But what they didn't know was that the true owner and mastermind behind it all was me. My name is Evelyn Carter, CEO and founder of Sterling Corporation, and I am Max's wife. The same woman he just mocked for his own entertainment in front of his colleagues. For the past 7 years, I've maintained this facade. When I first met Max, I decided to conduct an experiment. Instead of revealing that I was a successful businesswoman, I told him I was a struggling freelance financial consultant, still trying to find my place in the industry. I rented a modest apartment, drove an average car, and carried myself with quiet humility. At first, Max seemed like a warm and supportive man, encouraging me in the early years of our marriage. But that support slowly faded the moment he realized I didn't have a career he deemed worthy of pride. At least not by his standards. In Max's eyes, I was a lucky wife, fortunate to be financially supported by him. He thrived on playing the role of the hero, the sole provider, the one who held all the power in our marriage. Over time, he stopped hiding his contempt, and tonight, just like every other night, he used me as the punchline of his jokes. I quietly raised my wine glass to my lips, masking a faint smile. They didn't know. They didn't know that everything they had, their titles, their salaries, the multi-million-dollar contracts they boasted about, was in my hands. They didn't know that I was the one signing their promotions, approving their budgets, or even hiring the headhunting firms that had recruited each of them. And they certainly didn't know that by tomorrow, it would all be over. I had been planning this for a long time. After years of careful observation, gathering evidence, and meticulously setting each piece into place, I was ready to pull back the curtain. Sterling Corporation wasn't just the company I built. It was the perfect symbol of the revenge I was about to unleash. Max lifted his glass, toasting with his colleagues. "Let's drink to women who persevere, even when they fail over and over again," he said, casting a mocking glance in my direction. I set my glass down on the table and smiled softly. "Enjoy your night, gentlemen, because tomorrow everything will change forever." I had started gathering information nearly 2 years ago when the first signs of corruption and abuse of power from Max and his circle at Sterling Corporation began to surface. I had seen how they exploited their positions for personal gain, bent the rules, and manipulated contracts. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. I needed proof. So I hired a team of private investigators, the best in the business, to track their every move, every secret meeting, every lavish dinner paid for with company funds, every email exchanging favors with external partners. It was all meticulously documented. I even installed my own surveillance system, a hidden data collection network embedded within Sterling Corporation's internal infrastructure. What I uncovered was far worse than I had imagined. Max and his group weren't just corrupt. They were actively colluding with rival companies to line their own pockets, selling Sterling Corporation's confidential information and manipulating internal markets for their own benefit. I had everything: leaked emails, text messages discussing bid prices with competitors, even records of suspicious transactions flowing into their personal accounts. But perhaps the most repulsive discovery was the way they treated their subordinates: harassment, humiliation, exploitation of those who couldn't fight back. They had cultivated a toxic environment where only those who played their game could thrive. But gathering evidence alone wasn't enough. I needed a more powerful strike. I needed to witness firsthand the toxic culture they had cultivated. So I decided to experience it myself. I applied for a job at my own company, Of course, not under the name Evelyn Carter, CEO of Sterling Corporation, but as someone entirely different, Emily Brooks, an ordinary candidate looking for an opportunity. I created a completely new identity, carefully crafted to ensure that I appeared as nothing more than a struggling woman in the eyes of their recruitment team. They suspected nothing. A few days later, I received an email, an invitation for an interview. The interview took place in a small conference room on the 7th floor of Sterling Corporation's headquarters. I dressed in a modest, unassuming suit, deliberately choosing a pair of slightly worn shoes to match the image of a woman struggling to find employment. 3 men sat in the interview room, all of them Max's trusted subordinates. I recognized every single face. They had all been at the private gatherings where I was mocked behind my back. "You've been unemployed for quite some time, haven't you?" One of them sneered, flipping through my resume. "Yes, I've been trying to find a suitable position," I replied, deliberately keeping my voice timid and humble. "Unfortunately," another man said, looking me up and down with a condescending smirk, "the job market is very competitive these days. We receive hundreds of applications from candidates far more qualified than you." I could tell they had already made their decision the moment I walked into the room. They weren't interested in my skills or experience. All they saw was a mediocre woman with no connections, no value to exploit. The interview lasted exactly 15 minutes, but they spent more than half of it mocking me, rather than assessing my abilities. One of them even pulled out his phone and started texting while I was answering a question. I didn't need to see the screen to know who he was messaging, Max. And just as I expected, moments later, all 3 of their phones buzzed at the same time. "You've got to be kidding me," one of them chuckled, glancing down at his screen. I didn't have to look. I already knew what Max had sent. He knew I was here, and he was laughing at me. I was used to this, but I kept my act intact, lowering my head and mumbling a quiet thank you as they gave me their fake, insincere assurances that they would be in touch. I walked out of the interview room without a word. I didn't need to call back. I didn't need their approval. I had already gotten exactly what I wanted. I had seen how they operated, how they dismissed those they deemed unworthy, those they considered disposable, how they had cultivated a toxic culture where only men like Max could thrive. They thought they had control over everything. They thought they could continue to manipulate and destroy anyone they pleased. But tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, I would no longer be Emily Brooks, the unemployed woman. Tomorrow, I would step into that boardroom not as a desperate job applicant, but as the head of Sterling Corporation, and I would do something they never saw coming. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual, but this time, I didn't slip through the back entrance like a desperate candidate. I walked through the main lobby of Sterling Corporation, where employees hurried past, nodding politely without knowing who I was. That was fine. After today, they would never forget me. Inside the large conference room, everything was set. The shareholders had been summoned, the executive team was present, and on the massive screen behind me, all the evidence I had gathered over the past 2 years was ready to be exposed. I didn't need to say much. The proof would speak for itself. As the door swung open, Max and his closest colleagues walked in, still wearing their smug smiles. They believed this meeting was just another financial report, a routine gathering where they would be praised for their so-called achievements. They had no idea that today would be the last time they ever set foot in Sterling Corporation as men of power. I sat at the head of the table, calm and composed, watching as Max settled into his chair, the vice president's seat he had been so proud of. But when he saw me, his smile faltered. His voice wavered with confusion, and his eyes darted around the room, searching for answers, trying to understand why his unemployed wife was sitting in on a high-level executive meeting. But no one spoke to clarify things for him. I placed my hand on the thick folder in front of me, my voice cold and resolute, no longer carrying the humility Max had grown accustomed to over the years. "Sit down, Max. You and your friends will want to hear what I have to say." I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He hadn't fully realized that he was standing on the edge of a cliff, but he followed my command anyway. The other 4 men reluctantly sat, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "Before we begin," I continued, Locking eyes with Max and emphasizing each word, I would like to formally reintroduce myself. I am Evelyn Carter, founder and CEO of Sterling Corporation. A suffocating silence filled the room. The expressions of shock turned to sheer panic. Max looked like he had forgotten how to breathe, while his colleagues turned pale, beads of sweat forming on their brows. They were all scrambling to piece together the reality of the situation, but it was too late. I didn't stop. I clicked a button, and the massive screen came to life. On it, documents, emails, text messages, video recordings, and audio files appeared. Every shred of evidence detailing their corruption, leaked confidential information, workplace harassment, and contract manipulation. For the past 2 years, I had quietly gathered proof of their misconduct. I have records of every illegal transaction, I stated, my tone cool and unwavering. Every time company funds were abused for personal luxuries, every email exchange with our competitors, and even the conversations you all thought were private. I glanced at Max, watching as he struggled to swallow the lump in his throat. And don't worry, Max, I added, a quiet bitterness creeping into my voice. I haven't forgotten all those times you humiliated me in front of everyone. His mouth opened, but no words came out. I turned my gaze toward the shareholders, my presence now commanding the room. I have more than enough evidence to file reports with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the legal department, and federal investigators. But before I do that, there is one small matter I need to take care of first. I picked up the stack of termination documents and signed each one with precision, sliding them across the table toward Max and his cronies. Effective immediately, you are all fired from Sterling Corporation. Max shot up from his chair, his face flushed with a mix of anger and fear. You can't do this, he roared. I'm the vice president. I built this company. You didn't build anything, I cut him off, my voice cold and steady. I am the one who created this company. I am the one who hired you. I am the one who let you into my life, and now I am the one who is throwing you out of it. The doors to the boardroom swung open, and security stepped inside, ready to escort the newly terminated executives out of the building. Max staggered back, his eyes wide with sheer disbelief. He turned to his colleagues, desperately seeking support, but no one stood by him. Every single one of them lowered their heads, avoiding his gaze. He was alone. I calmly gathered the remaining documents in front of me. Your belongings have been packed. Your access to the company systems has been revoked. Leave quietly before I make this even worse for you. Max trembled as he looked at me, but he had nothing left to say. One by one, they were escorted out of the room. I didn't bother watching them go. From the upper floors, I could see a crowd of employees gathering in the lobby, peering through the massive glass panels. News had spread fast. Sterling Corporation had finally cut away the cancer that had been rotting it from the inside. It took only a few hours for the story to break. Financial news outlets erupted with headlines about the massive purge at Sterling Corporation. Social media exploded as people dug into Max and his group's past, uncovering countless stories of how they had abused their power within the company. The phone calls from rival firms started coming in, but not to recruit Max and his associates. No one wanted to be associated with the men Sterling Corporation had just publicly exposed. One by one, Max's circle crumbled. A week later, I received news that 3 of their wives had filed for divorce. They had no way to hold on to the luxurious lives they once flaunted. Max, the man who once sat in a corner office with a panoramic view of the city, was now working as a sales associate in a small electronics store in the suburbs. He could no longer hold his head high. And me? I didn't need to lift my head to know that I had won. I didn't need to seek vengeance and cruelty. What I had done wasn't just about destroying others. It was about restoring justice. I had reclaimed what was mine. Max's downfall was merely a byproduct of something much larger than revenge. 3 months after Max and his group were removed, Sterling Corporation was no longer the company they once controlled. I sat in my own corner office, gazing out at the expanse of New York City under the morning sun. The company I had built from the ground up had finally returned to its original purpose, a place of innovation, creativity, and progress, untainted by opportunists. The Reformation had begun on day 1 after the purge. I called for an all-company meeting. stepping before thousands of employees for the first time, not as Max's unemployed wife, but as Evelyn Carter, CEO and founder of Sterling Corporation. "We're starting over," I told them, and this time no one would be left behind. The changes came swiftly. I fired every person who had enabled Max and his group, especially those in HR, the ones who had turned a blind eye to harassment and discrimination for years. The vacant positions were filled with highly skilled professionals, many of whom had been pushed out under the old regime. Within a month, more than 20 former employees were invited back, people who had been forced to leave simply because they refused to conform to a corrupt system. Among them was Lisa Hall, an exceptional software engineer whom Max had personally removed from a major project simply because she refused to join his pointless drinking parties. When I called Lisa and offered her the opportunity to return, she hesitated. "Do you really want me back?" she asked over the phone, her voice laced with disbelief. "I don't just want you back," I told her. "I want you to lead our new AI research team." A week later, Lisa walked back into Sterling Corporation for the first time, stepping through the front doors without fear. The company culture had transformed completely. I implemented stricter transparency policies, an anonymous reporting system where employees could safely report internal issues without fear of retaliation. Every senior manager was required to undergo ethics and leadership training. But I didn't stop there. We launched an employee mentorship program where experienced professionals would guide and support new employees instead of tearing them down the way Max and his colleagues had done. Anyone found guilty of harassment or abuse of power was dealt with immediately. The atmosphere in the company changed day by day. Smiles returned to employees' faces. Meetings were no longer filled with condescending glances or passive-aggressive remarks. For the first time in years, I could walk through the halls of Sterling Corporation without feeling the crushing weight of a toxic environment. As the internal culture stabilized, the company's financial results quickly reflected the transformation. In just 2 months, Sterling Corporation signed 3 major contracts, one of which was with a leading telecommunications conglomerate. Previously, they had refused to work with Sterling, partly due to the bad reputation the company had earned under Max's leadership. But once news of my corporate overhaul spread, they approached us instead. Stock prices soared by 35% within 3 months. Investors who had once hesitated due to Max's leadership now had full confidence in me. The media began praising Sterling Corporation's dramatic resurgence. A Business Insider article even dubbed me the woman who revived a tech empire. But what satisfied me most wasn't the numbers or the headlines. It was seeing the faces of the employees who had been ignored and mistreated under the old regime. People like Lisa, who had once been discarded for her refusal to conform to Max's toxic culture. Now, she was leading a team, innovating new technologies that would push the company to new heights. Sterling Corporation wasn't just a successful business. It had become a symbol of integrity and innovation in a world that so often valued power and manipulation over talent and hard work. I knew that this was only the beginning. Max and his group had been the cancer that threatened to destroy everything. But now, they were nothing more than a distant memory. The company I had created was no longer under the control of men like Max, men who sought to tear down others for their own benefit. It was now a company led by those who truly deserved it. As I sat in my office, watching the city below, I felt a deep sense of pride. This was my moment, the culmination of everything I had worked for. Sterling Corporation was stronger than ever, and it would only continue to grow. The past had been painful, but it had shaped me into the leader I was today. And for the first time in a long time, I could finally say I was at peace with what I had accomplished. I no longer dwelled on the past. I used to think that seeing Max hit rock bottom would bring me satisfaction, but the truth was, I didn't care anymore. Revenge was no longer my motivation. What I did wasn't just about bringing Max down. It was about restoring justice for those he had stepped on and rebuilding the company I had built with my own blood, sweat, and intellect. There are days when I sit in my office reflecting on everything that has happened. I think about the first time I met Max, when I still believed he was a good man. I think about all the times I forced myself to smile through his cruel jokes. I think about the moment I walked into that boardroom, stood in front of him, and revealed the truth. But now, it's all just a story from the past. I spent too much time living in Max's shadow, letting him believe he had control over my life. But not anymore. Now I only care about the future. The future of Sterling Corporation. The company is expanding rapidly. We just signed a partnership deal with a leading software corporation, extending our operations into Europe. Lisa's AI research team has exceeded all expectations, and she is now one of the most influential leaders in the company. I also launched a mentorship program specifically for young women pursuing careers in tech. I know that far too many talented individuals have been pushed aside simply because they lack the power to fight back. I won't let that happen anymore. Sterling Corporation will not just be a successful company, it will be a symbol of fairness, innovation, and people who refuse to be silenced. And I will make sure that it stays that way. One morning, as I stood by my office window, watching the sun rise over the skyline, I realized that this was the moment I had worked so hard for. No longer was I just the woman behind the scenes, hiding in the shadows. I was the one who had turned this company around, who had breathed life back into a place that had once been rotten to the core. And now, Sterling was thriving. 3 months after the purge, Sterling Corporation was no longer the company they once controlled. I sat in my own corner office, gazing out at the expanse of New York City under the morning sun. The company I had built from the ground up had finally returned to its original purpose, a place of innovation, creativity, and progress, untainted by opportunists. The Reformation had begun on day one after the purge. I called for an all-company meeting, stepping before thousands of employees for the first time, not as Max's unemployed wife, but as Evelyn Carter, CEO of Sterling Corporation. We're starting over, I told them, and this time no one would be left behind. The changes came swiftly. I fired every person who had enabled Max and his group, especially those in HR, the ones who had turned a blind eye to harassment and discrimination for years. The vacant positions were filled with highly skilled professionals, many of whom had been pushed out under the old regime. Within a month, more than 20 former employees were invited back, people who had been forced to leave simply because they refused to conform to a corrupt system. Among them was Lisa Hall, an exceptional software engineer whom Max had personally removed from a major project simply because she refused to join his pointless drinking parties. When I called Lisa and offered her the opportunity to return, she hesitated. "Do you really want me back?" she asked over the phone, her voice laced with disbelief. "I don't just want you back," I told her. "I want you to lead our new AI research team." A week later, Lisa walked back into Sterling Corporation for the first time, stepping through the front doors without fear. The company culture had transformed completely. I implemented stricter transparency policies, an anonymous reporting system where employees could safely report internal issues without fear of retaliation. Every senior manager was required to undergo ethics and leadership training. But I didn't stop there. We launched an employee mentorship program where experienced professionals would guide and support new employees, instead of tearing them down the way Max and his colleagues had done. Anyone found guilty of harassment or abuse of power was dealt with immediately. The atmosphere in the company changed day by day. Smiles returned to employees' faces. Meetings were no longer filled with condescending glances or passive-aggressive remarks. For the first time in years, I could walk through the halls of Sterling Corporation without feeling the crushing weight of a toxic environment. Sterling Corporation was growing stronger every day, but there was still work to be done. The changes we had implemented were only the beginning. The journey had been long, and I knew the road ahead would require constant vigilance. Still, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. For the first time in years, the company I had built was thriving, and its success was rooted in integrity, not manipulation or exploitation. Lisa's AI research team had already delivered groundbreaking results. They were working on projects that would revolutionize the tech industry. The innovations they were developing weren't just about profits. They were about making a real impact. For the first time in a long time, I felt proud to be part of something that wasn't just about building wealth, but about creating something meaningful. Our expansion into Europe was on track, and the partnership deal with the software corporation was only the first of many. I began to envision Sterling's future, not just as a market leader, but as a beacon for what a company could be when it was built on principles of fairness, transparency, and respect. We were positioning ourselves to lead the industry in ways that Max and his group had never even considered. But even as we moved forward, I knew I had to stay focused. The scars of the past still lingered. Max and his associates may have been gone, but there were still those who had been complicit in their reign. I couldn't afford to forget that. Every week, I sat down with the legal and HR teams, reviewing the ongoing efforts to ensure that no one else was undermining the company from within. I wanted Sterling Corporation to be a place where everyone, regardless of their role, could thrive without fear of being taken advantage of. It wasn't just about cleaning house. It was about building a new foundation that would stand the test of time. The employees who had returned under the new regime were proving themselves every day. They were eager to prove that Sterling Corporation could be more than just a company. It could be a community where talent was recognized, hard work was celebrated, and personal integrity wasn't just a nice idea, but a fundamental part of the company's DNA. One afternoon, as I walked through the halls of the building, I passed by a group of employees gathered in one of the meeting rooms. They were deep in conversation, brainstorming ideas for the next big project. I stopped for a moment to listen, smiling to myself. This was the energy I had hoped for, the collaborative spirit, the excitement about what the future held. I entered my office, closing the door behind me. I sat at my desk, gazing out at the city below. It was an odd feeling, knowing that the company I had started was now stronger than it had ever been. And it was also a strange sense of peace. In those early days, when I was still figuring out how to balance everything, I couldn't have imagined that I would be here today. I had thought that revenge would bring me the closure I needed. But now I realized it wasn't about revenge at all. It was about proving to myself that I could overcome everything that had been thrown my way. It was about showing the world that a woman in control could lead a company to greatness, no matter how many people tried to hold her back. Max and his group were gone, but the impact they had on the company would be felt for years to come. I had spent so many years running on the treadmill of their cruelty, working tirelessly to keep everything afloat. But now, I was running for myself. And Sterling Corporation, finally, was running alongside me. Months passed, and the transformation at Sterling Corporation continued to unfold. We had not only cleaned up the company, but we had redefined what it stood for. The old ways of arrogance and manipulation were gone. The employees were no longer afraid to speak up or challenge the status quo, and the results spoke for themselves. Our profits had reached new heights, and the industry was starting to take notice of what we were building. But while Sterling thrived, my personal life had taken a very different direction. Max's fall from grace wasn't the only consequence of his actions. His once vibrant circle of power had dissolved, and those who had once followed him were now scattered, their careers and reputations in shambles. But there were still lingering consequences, some of them more personal. It wasn't just the company that had been affected by his toxicity. It was our marriage, too. Max had once been the man I had loved, the man I had stood by, believing in him when no one else did. But over the years, his contempt for me had slowly suffocated whatever we had once shared. His mocking remarks, his superiority, the way he treated me as if I was nothing more than a trophy wife. Those things had chipped away at my heart for far too long. As Sterling Corporation soared, I found myself reflecting on my own journey, not just the professional one, but the personal one too. I had spent so many years bending and compromising for the sake of Max's ego, for the sake of keeping peace in a marriage that had long since lost its spark. But now I was free of that burden. I had rebuilt myself, both as a leader and as an individual. Max had faded from my thoughts. I rarely thought about him anymore. The satisfaction of seeing him brought low had long since worn off, replaced by the realization that I had outgrown him, outgrown everything he represented. The man I had once considered my equal was now nothing more than a shadow of his former self, a reminder of a past I had moved on from. But even with the emotional distance I had created, there were still moments when memories of the past crept in. I would see something that reminded me of him, a place we used to visit, a story someone would mention. And for a split second, I would feel the old anger rise up, but I quickly pushed it aside. I had no use for the bitterness that had once fueled my every move. The only thing that mattered now was the future. The future of Sterling Corporation and the future of the people who truly deserved to be part of it. There was a knock on my office door, and I looked up to see Lisa standing there with a bright smile. She had been one of the first to return to the company, and in the time since, she had blossomed into a leader in her own right. She was now heading the AI research division, and her team's work had already attracted major attention. "I just wanted to check in with you," she said, stepping inside. "Things are going great with the team. They're more motivated than ever." I smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through me at the sight of her confidence. Lisa had been one of the employees who had suffered most under Max's reign. She had been silenced, dismissed, and pushed aside for standing up for what was right. But now, she was thriving, and so was Sterling Corporation. "I'm glad to hear that," I said. "You've been doing amazing work, Lisa. I'm proud of what we're building together." She grinned, clearly proud of how far she had come. "We all are," she replied. "And it's because of you. You gave us a chance." Her words hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't the first time someone had told me I had changed things for the better, but hearing it from Lisa, someone who had been pushed out and then brought back into the fold, felt like a full circle moment. It reminded me that the work we had done wasn't just about dismantling corruption, it was about creating opportunities for people who deserved them. People like Lisa. I watched her leave my office, and for a brief moment, I sat in silence, thinking about how much had changed. Max was a footnote in history, and I was living proof that success wasn't about taking advantage of others. It was about lifting people up, giving them the tools and the opportunities they needed to succeed on their own terms. And as Sterling continued to grow, I knew that the company was no longer just mine. It was the collective achievement of everyone who had fought through the darkness and into the light. There was still a long road ahead. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I was walking it with purpose. As the months continued to pass, I could feel the weight of the past slowly lifting. Sterling Corporation had become everything I had hoped it would be, an organization built on trust, transparency, and innovation. But what struck me the most wasn't just the company's success. It was how far I had come as a person. The struggle to get to this point had been long and painful, but it had transformed me. In the process of tearing down everything Max had built and rebuilding something better, I had rediscovered myself. I was no longer the woman who had stood silently by while others belittled her. I was the leader of one of the most successful tech companies in the world, and I was damn proud of it. Max and his former colleagues had been forgotten, their names buried under the weight of their own arrogance. They had been so certain of their power, so sure that nothing would ever touch them. But I had shown them otherwise. I had brought them down not with cruelty, but with precision and purpose. And now, as I looked out at the bustling headquarters of Sterling, I knew that they had no place in this world anymore. But despite all the victories, there was one thing that lingered in my mind. The feeling of satisfaction that I thought would come with their downfall was not as strong as I had imagined. It wasn't the crushing defeat of my enemies that mattered anymore. It was the freedom I had found for myself. I had spent so many years living in their shadow, trying to prove myself to people who never cared. But now, I was free. Free from their expectations, free from their mockery, and free from the toxic world they had created. For the first time in a long time, I could breathe without that constant weight pressing down on me. Sterling was flourishing, and I was no longer the woman who had been cast aside. I had taken control, not just of the company, but of my own life. I had learned the value of standing up for myself, of making tough decisions, and of never backing down from what I knew was right. The road hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every sacrifice. Sitting in my office, I looked at the city below, the skyline stretching endlessly before me. I thought back to the days when I was a struggling freelancer, pretending to be someone I wasn't, just to keep the peace. I remembered how Max had mocked me, how I had swallowed my pride for so long, hoping that someday he would see me as more than just his wife. But I had grown beyond that. I had learned that true power didn't come from titles or wealth. It came from resilience, from the ability to weather storms and keep moving forward. And as I watched the employees of Sterling Corporation work together, collaborating, creating, and innovating, I realized that what I had built was more than just a company. It was a legacy. Sterling wasn't just a business. It was a symbol of what could happen when people were given the chance to thrive, a symbol of fairness, respect, and a future where everyone had a voice. And that, more than anything, was what made me proud. I stood up, looking around the office that had once felt so cold and lonely. Now it felt like home. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hall outside, the buzz of conversation filling the air. This was a place of opportunity, of change, and of growth. It was a place where people could come together and create something meaningful. And as I walked through the halls, I realized that the journey I had started years ago had led me to this moment, the moment where I could finally say that I had done it. I had built something incredible. Not just a company, but a community. Not just a legacy for myself, but for everyone who had ever been pushed aside, who had ever been told they didn't matter. Sterling Corporation had become a symbol of what happens when someone refuses to be silenced. And I had been the one to make it happen. I wasn't the woman I had been when I first walked into that boardroom. I was Evelyn Carter, CEO and founder of Sterling Corporation. And this was only the beginning.